He'd survived the jungles of Vietnam, seen comrades fall beside him, and carried secrets the government still won't acknowledge. But none of that mattered on a warm Tuesday afternoon when 74-year-old Harold Jenkins sat alone in a booth at Marlene's diner waiting for his slice of pecan pie. The diner wasn't fancy, just a quiet place where the regulars called each other Hon, and the jukebox still worked when you gave it a firm slap. Harold had been coming here for over a decade, always ordering the same thing: black coffee, no cream, and whatever pie they had fresh. He was known but not loud, respected but never flashy. Just an old black man with quiet eyes and a cap stitched with US Army veteran in gold thread, faded now but still proud. That cap should have spoken for him. It should have earned him a nod, maybe a thank you for your service. But when two officers walked in that day, new faces in town, unfamiliar with the locals, the cap didn't matter. Harold didn't even notice them at first. He was busy reading the local paper, circling items in the classifieds out of habit, not need. The officers looked around like they were hunting something. One pointed in Harold's direction, the other nodded. They approached slowly, one hand near his belt. "Sir, we need to speak with you," one of them said, already sounding like a warning. Harold folded the paper carefully, set it beside his cup and looked up. "About what?" he asked, voice steady but soft. "Got a call about a man fitting your description. Suspicious behavior over at the hardware store. We just need you to come with us for a few questions." Harold raised an eyebrow. "You're arresting me over a hardware visit?" They didn't answer. They asked him to stand. He did, calmly. When they pulled out the cuffs, the waitress, Janice, stepped forward. Wait, what is this? That's Harold. He's here almost every day." But it didn't matter. The cuffs clicked shut. Harold didn't resist. He just looked around once, slowly, at the familiar booths, the cracked linoleum floor, and then let himself be led outside like a man who had seen this kind of ignorance before, like a man who had stopped being surprised by it long ago. The people watching didn't know the half of it. They didn't know who Harold Jenkins really was. They didn't know that 30 years ago his name wasn't even supposed to be on record, that his missions overseas were redacted, his role in federal operations buried under layers of classification. They didn't know that long after the war, Harold worked quietly for a federal task force that had nothing to do with local hardware stores and everything to do with national security. The kind of work where your name gets erased from newsletters and your success is measured by how invisible you can stay. After retirement, Harold chose Crestwood because it was quiet, uneventful. The kind of town where a man could disappear from headlines and finally sleep through the night. His house was modest, his life routine. The neighbors knew he was a veteran, but not much else. That was by design. He didn't want a parade, he wanted peace. But what the officers didn't understand, what they couldn't have known, is that men like Harold don't make idle phone calls when things go wrong. They make one call, to one number, and when that number rings, people answer. Fast. So when Harold sat in that holding cell 20 minutes later, quiet and unshaken, it wasn't because he was scared, it was because he was waiting. Not for a lawyer, not for a town councilman. He was waiting for a response from the kind of people who don't knock when they enter, the kind who know his history better than anyone in that station ever will, the kind who owe him more than a few favors and have the power to settle a mistake like this in under an hour. And that's exactly what was about to happen. The hardware store incident started like nothing. A moment so ordinary it shouldn't have mattered at all. Just a man asking a question at a counter. Harold had gone in that morning with a handwritten note in his coat pocket. A small sketch and dimensions for a metal bracket he'd been wanting to replicate for a home repair project. He liked fixing things. That's what he'd always done. Overseas, in government work, and now in retirement. Quiet repairs, small problems solved before they became big ones. He waited patiently in the aisle, looked over a few items, then approached the front desk where a young employee named Brett stood. Brett was new, barely 21, and jittery even when things were calm. When Harold asked about getting a custom part cut, Brett hesitated. Not because of the request, but because Harold didn't sound like someone unsure. He spoke with clarity, precision, like a man used to getting results. Brett glanced at the diagram. You, work with machinery?" he asked. "Not anymore," Harold said, "but I know what I need." Brett gave a nervous smile and said he'd have to ask the manager. Harold nodded and stepped back. But Brett didn't go to the back. He went into the break room, shut the door, and picked up the store's emergency line. When asked later why he called the police, Brett fumbled through a half explanation, said Harold was too calm, that he seemed like he was testing something, claimed that the way Harold spoke didn't sit right with him. No threat, no raised voice, no confrontation, just a black man with a technical request and a military presence. That was enough for Brett to feel uneasy, and enough for 2 officers to be dispatched, no questions asked. Back at the diner, the officers arrived just as Harold was finishing his coffee. They'd been told to look for a suspicious elderly male who'd made the staff at Ridge Hardware uncomfortable. They didn't know his name. They didn't ask for it. They were told he might be casing the place, whatever that meant. That's all it took, that vague suspicion, that uncomfortable feeling. And Harold was now in the back seat of a patrol car, staring out the window as the town rolled by, hands still cuffed behind his back. At the station, Officer Langley, tall, thin and arrogant in the way only young authority can be, smirked as he walked Harold down the hall. "You know, you could have just stayed home today, saved yourself a trip," he said, like Harold was the punchline to some half-baked joke. Harold didn't reply. He just moved forward with the quiet grace of someone who'd been down darker hallways than this one. They put him in a holding cell without formally charging him, said it was just for questioning. He didn't argue, didn't ask for a lawyer. He asked for one thing, a phone call. Langley looked at him, clearly amused. "You think you're in a movie?" Harold looked back, not with anger, not with fear, but with the kind of weight that makes a room feel smaller. "You're going to want to let me make it." Langley rolled his eyes but gave in. "Fine, one call." Harold dialed a number from memory. No contact name, no notes, just digits burned into his mind from years ago, from when he still carried a federal badge and worked in places where even your shadow wasn't allowed to follow. The phone rang once, then a voice answered, calm, professional, alert. Harold gave his name. "It's Jenkins, Crestwood Police Station. I've been picked up. I'm going to need confirmation sent." That was it. Less than 20 seconds, the line went dead. Langley, half watching, smirked. "You done?" "I'm done," Harold replied, and then he waited. 15 minutes passed. Langley went back to chatting with Officer Meadows, the 2 of them laughing about an earlier call involving raccoons in a dumpster. They didn't check the system, didn't call dispatch for clarification. They assumed they were in control. But Harold didn't look worried. He wasn't pacing, wasn't rattled. He sat still on the bench, legs relaxed, eyes on the wall, like he'd seen this whole thing before. Because he had. Not in a small-town police station, but in rooms with concrete floors and armed guards who didn't ask twice. He'd been interrogated, observed, even hunted, and he knew the difference between being in danger and being underestimated. The difference here was simple. Harold wasn't the one on borrowed time, because the next knock on the door wasn't going to come from a lawyer. It was going to come from someone with far more authority, and someone who knew exactly what kind of mistake had just been made. The shift began with a silence, the kind of silence that doesn't belong in a police station. The low hum of casual chatter that had filled the room slowly faded, as if the atmosphere itself knew something was coming. Outside, a black SUV rolled to a stop in front of the building, its windows tinted so dark the reflection of the station flickered on its surface like a warning. No sirens, no urgency in motion, just precision. 2 individuals stepped out, dark blue suits, polished shoes, federal badges already in hand. They moved with the quiet authority of people who never had to announce themselves because their presence did all the talking. Inside the Crestwood police station, Langley leaned back in his chair, sipping lukewarm coffee and still chuckling over something meaningless. The front door buzzed open. The air shifted. The woman who entered first spoke with a voice that cut clean through the room. Not loud, not aggressive, but the kind of voice that made people straighten in their chairs. "We're here for Mr. Harold Jenkins," she said flatly. "Take us to him now." The desk sergeant blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry, who exactly are you?" She raised her badge, flipping it open like a verdict. "Special Agent Renee Waters, Federal Intelligence Division. This is Agent Bishop. I need access to your holding area immediately." The name didn't register with most people in the room, but Harold knew it the moment she said it. The voice, the name, the way she didn't hesitate. He'd trained agents like her once, not directly, never officially, but his influence had shaped that division. He'd helped build the operational structure she now walked under. Bishop was younger, broader, and scanning the room with silent calculation. They weren't here for diplomacy. They were here for correction. Langley stood up too fast, trying to recover some sense of control. Whoa, hold on. We brought the guy in on a report of suspicious behavior. We're just trying to do our job here. Renee turned her eyes to him, and Langley didn't realize how quiet the station had become until that moment. You arrested Harold Jenkins without verifying his identity. You held him without probable cause, and you failed to conduct any internal check before placing him in a cell. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Langley stammered. Okay, look, he didn't tell us who he was. Bishop finally spoke, just 2 words. He didn't have to. By the time they reached the holding cell, Harold was already standing. He had heard the voices. He knew they'd come. When Renee stepped forward and opened the door herself, Harold gave her a small nod. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Bishop remained by the door, watching the officers behind them like they might try to defend the mistake they'd just made. Harold stepped out, shoulders square, steps even. It wasn't about walking free, it was about how he walked. A presence that filled the station without force, just certainty. Renee turned to Langley and the others. You'll be contacted by your Internal Affairs office. Effective immediately, Mr. Jenkins is to be treated as a protected civilian asset under federal jurisdiction. Any further interaction with him must be approved through our office. And if you're wondering what kind of mistake you've made, ask your supervisor, if they're still working tomorrow. Langley's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Meadows shifted uncomfortably. The other officers stared at Harold now, not as a suspect, not as a threat, but as something else entirely. Someone with power that didn't come from loudness, but from legacy. As Harold walked toward the exit with the agents beside him, something deeper settled over the station. It wasn't fear, it wasn't shame, not yet. It was realization. Realization that the man they had cuffed like a petty criminal had once sat in rooms where the fate of nations was discussed. That while they joked behind desks, he had spent years keeping the very idea of safety from falling apart. And they'd dragged him out of a diner for asking a hardware question. That's when regret really began. Not because the FBI had shown up, not because phones were about to start ringing in every office from Crestwood to DC, but because they knew, deep down knew, that Harold Jenkins had given them a chance to get it right. He had complied. He had been calm. He hadn't pulled rank. And they had still looked right through him. Now the question wasn't how they'd fix it. The question was if it could ever be fixed. Because Harold hadn't come back to that diner to make noise. But someone was going to make noise now. And every badge in that station knew they were no longer in charge of what happened next. Regret is a strange thing. It doesn't always show up in the moment of the mistake. Sometimes it arrives in the silence that follows, when the adrenaline fades and you realize the weight of what you've done. For Officer Langley, that moment hit hardest when Harold Jenkins walked out of the Crestwood station without saying a single word to him. No accusation, no insult, not even a backward glance. Just quiet dignity, the kind you can't manufacture, the kind that makes your own behavior echo louder in your head than anything anyone else could say. Langley stood there like a man who'd just realized the fire he lit was about to burn down his entire house. For the first time since putting on that badge, he wasn't sure what came next. He looked to Meadows, hoping for some mutual shrug, some silent, "we didn't know." But Meadows didn't meet his eyes. Because now they knew. Everyone in that building did. That name, Harold Jenkins, wasn't just going to disappear into paperwork. It was about to show up on reports, on calls, on meetings behind closed doors. The phone started ringing before Harold even reached the SUV outside. First it was the chief's office, then the mayor's assistant. By the time Langley sat back down, his inbox had 3 flagged messages, all marked urgent, in bold red letters. The town's official email was already pinging with media inquiries, and someone had apparently posted a clip of the arrest online. It wasn't long, just a few seconds, Harold standing calmly as the cuffs were placed. His veteran cap still on his head, the waitress shouting in the background that he didn't do anything. That was all it took. One short video, 1,000 comments, most of them asking the same question: why are you arresting a veteran without cause? Inside the SUV, Harold didn't ask where they were going. He didn't need to. Renee knew better than to flood him with apologies. Bishop didn't say a word. The vehicle pulled onto the highway and disappeared from Crestwood's limits, leaving behind a station that felt colder now, even though the air hadn't changed. Langley paced. Meadows kept checking the door like someone else was going to walk in. Every second that passed felt heavier than the last. Meanwhile, across town, the mayor's phone lit up. He'd just stepped out of a planning meeting when his aide stopped him in the hallway with a look that said this wasn't a zoning issue. "You need to see this," she said, handing him her tablet. The video played, and the mayor's eyes narrowed. He knew Harold, everyone did, even if they didn't know him. Harold had attended local events, spoken at Veterans Day ceremonies, donated anonymously to the library fund, and helped restore the old flagpole in front of City Hall. The man had given more to Crestwood than half the officials on payroll, and now they were fielding calls about why he'd been paraded out of a diner in cuffs like a common criminal. Back at the station, the fallout kept building. IA had already launched a preliminary review, requesting body cam footage and dispatch recordings. But the real problem wasn't policy, it was perception. No amount of backpedaling was going to explain away what people had seen with their own eyes. A decorated black veteran treated like a threat for nothing more than walking into the wrong store with the wrong skin and the wrong posture. And then came the real blow. That evening, an email went out from a federal liaison. It was short, professional, direct. It stated that Harold Jenkins had previously served in a classified capacity under the Department of Defense and had also worked with federal security contractors on projects that, to this day, remained sealed. It said that any future contact with Mr. Jenkins would require federal clearance and prior notification. And finally, it concluded with the one sentence that stopped every officer in the department cold. This individual is to be treated with the highest level of respect due to his service history and clearance record. The message was clear. They hadn't just embarrassed themselves. They'd embarrassed themselves to the federal government. And worse still, Harold hadn't done anything to make it happen. No press conference, no interview, he didn't file a complaint. He just made one phone call, one quiet message. And that was enough to bring the full weight of accountability to their doorstep. The regret that began with confusion had now turned into something deeper. Fear. Not fear of punishment, fear of exposure. Because the truth wasn't just about Harold, it was about what his treatment revealed. About how easy it had been to dismiss him. About how automatic the assumptions were. And if they could do that to him, who else had they done it to without the same outcome? How many people had walked into that station, been met with smirks and sideways glances, and walked out feeling smaller than they were? That night, the station emptied out quietly. No jokes, no laughter, no one hanging around after their shift. Langley sat alone at his desk long after everyone left, replaying the moment he clicked those cuffs closed, the sound of metal echoing louder now than it ever had before. Across town, Harold sat on his porch sipping tea as the sun went down. He didn't need to follow the headlines or check his phone. He knew exactly what kind of ripple had been set in motion, and he didn't need revenge. He had something stronger: truth, dignity, and silence. And silence, when it lands on the guilty, speaks louder than any speech ever could. 3 days later, just before noon, a white patrol car pulled slowly into Harold Jenkins' driveway. It didn't flash its lights, didn't honk. It simply came to a stop and sat there for a few seconds, engine humming like it didn't want to be noticed. Then the door opened and Officer Langley stepped out, his uniform crisp but clearly ironed with more care than usual. He wasn't holding anything except his cap, which he gripped nervously in both hands as he approached the modest porch where Harold sat beneath the shade of an old pecan tree, sipping tea and watching the wind move across his yard. Langley stopped at the bottom of the steps and stood in silence, unsure whether to speak first or wait to be acknowledged. Harold didn't rush to break the tension. He didn't invite the officer up or offer a seat. He just took another slow sip of tea, eyes steady. Finally, Langley cleared his throat. "Mr. Jenkins, I know I've got no right to be here. I needed to say something." Harold didn't interrupt. He didn't nod, didn't scowl. He simply let the words hang. So Langley continued. I didn't know. I didn't know who you were. I didn't take the time to find out. I made assumptions, and I treated you like a threat. I was wrong. His voice cracked slightly, not from fear of consequences, but from the kind of discomfort that only comes from facing yourself in full. I disrespected you. I disrespected everything you've done, and I understand if you never want to see me again. But I had to come here and look you in the eye, not as a cop, just as a man who messed up. Harold sat there a while, not speaking. Then slowly, he leaned forward and rested his glass on the table beside him. You didn't just mess up, he said. You confirmed something I've seen my entire life, that respect has a dress code, that credibility has a skin tone, that a man can serve his country in silence for 50 years and still be seen as a problem the moment he stops fitting into someone else's expectation of what safe looks like. Langley's eyes dropped to the porch floorboards. I know, he said quietly. Or at least, I'm starting to. Harold's voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. I'm not interested in an apology that stops here. I've had men apologize to me their whole lives. What I'm interested in is what you do when I'm not in front of you, when it's someone else, when nobody knows who they are. Langley nodded slowly. I hear you. And for the first time in that conversation, Harold nodded back. Not a gesture of forgiveness. Not yet, but a gesture of understanding, the smallest sign that growth was possible, even if it would take time. But the truth was, this wasn't about Langley anymore. The story had already moved beyond him, because what happened next didn't take place on Harold's porch or inside the walls of that small police station. It happened quietly, across boardrooms and leadership meetings, in conference calls that began with tension and ended in silence. Within the week, the incident had made its way into national media outlets, not as breaking news, but as a case study. An example of what happens when institutional bias meets the wrong man at the wrong moment. The story wasn't spun into outrage, it was laid bare. Because Harold hadn't made it about race alone, he hadn't made it about authority either. He made it about assumptions, and how deadly they become when dressed in protocol. Federal offices issued statements of continued investigation, and local governments scrambled to draft new training initiatives. But what couldn't be manufactured was the shift in tone. Something deeper had changed. Harold Jenkins had become a quiet kind of symbol. Not the angry protester, not the political firebrand. Just a man who had earned the benefit of the doubt 1,000 times over, and still didn't receive it until the system was forced to remember who he was. What stayed with people wasn't the fact that the FBI had intervened. It wasn't even the apology. It was the way Harold carried himself through it all. He never raised his voice, never needed to. The calm he displayed had weight. It exposed everyone else's reactions for what they really were, not responses to a threat, but reactions to a story they'd written in their heads before he even said a word. And in the weeks that followed, something else happened. A few other veterans from the community came forward, people who'd been quietly dismissed, overlooked, questioned. Not dramatic stories, just patterns, small humiliations. Men who had served decades ago, now treated like they no longer mattered because they didn't wear suits or badges or anything that demanded respect at first glance. Harold's story gave theirs a place to land. It gave them words. It gave them proof that even when you think no one's watching, someone is keeping track. But perhaps the most powerful moment came a month later, at a town hall meeting where Harold had been invited, officially this time, to speak. He didn't go with a speech. He didn't talk about what happened at the station. Instead, he asked a single question. What would you do differently if you didn't know who someone was? The room went still, because that was the truth at the heart of everything. We like to think we treat people equally, but we don't. We treat people based on what we think they're worth. Based on clothes, skin, voice, posture, reputation, we extend dignity based on familiarity. But Harold Jenkins reminded an entire town that respect shouldn't be a reward. It should be the starting point. And so he walked off that stage without applause, without fanfare, just like he walked out of the station. Quiet, measured, free. Not because someone gave him his freedom, but because it was his all along, and no badge, no arrest, no mistake could ever take it from him again.